The political debate stage was set for what everyone thought would be another routine discussion about border security. The studio lights blazed down on the polished wooden podiums, casting sharp shadows across the carefully arranged stage. Kari Lake sat confidently in her red blazer, ready to deliver her usual fiery rhetoric, her signature blonde hair perfectly styled for the cameras. Jasmine Crockett appeared calm in her navy blue suit, hands folded, seemingly unprepared for what was about to unfold. The audience buzzed with anticipation, phones already recording, expecting another typical political showdown. But what happened in the next 30 seconds would leave the entire audience speechless and change everything. Lake had just finished a passionate speech about illegal immigration when Crockett made a simple statement that would trigger an explosion nobody saw coming. "The data doesn't support your claims, Carrie," she said quietly into her microphone. Those 8 words would unleash a volcanic eruption from Lake that shocked everyone in the room. What followed was the most dramatic political meltdown captured on live television this year. Lake's face turned red, her voice cracked as she screamed across the stage, and her carefully crafted political image crumbled in real time. But Crockett's response? Nobody could have predicted the calm, devastating reply that would make Lake's outburst look even worse. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these explosive political moments that everyone will be talking about tomorrow. The studio lights were blazing hot that evening as 2 of America's most talked about political figures prepared for what was supposed to be a civil discussion about immigration policy. Kari Lake, the former news anchor turned political firebrand, had arrived with her usual confidence. Her red blazer was perfectly pressed, her blonde hair styled to perfection, and her talking points rehearsed to the second. Across the stage sat Jasmine Crockett, the Texas representative known for her legal background and measured approach to politics. She wore a navy blue suit that projected professionalism, her natural hair styled elegantly, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years in courtrooms before entering politics. The audience was packed, with supporters from both sides. Lake's fans filled the right side of the room, wearing red hats and holding signs with her name. They had come expecting their champion to deliver another passionate performance about border security and conservative values. On the left side, Crockett's supporters sat more quietly, many holding phones to record what they hoped would be their representative's moment to shine. The debate moderator introduced both women, highlighting their backgrounds and the topic of discussion. Lake smiled broadly, waving to her supporters who erupted in cheers. Crockett nodded politely, acknowledging the applause from her side with a slight smile. The stage was set for what everyone thought would be another predictable political back and forth, but something was different that night. Lake seemed more agitated than usual, her movements more sharp, her smile more forced. Those who knew her well might have noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted her microphone, or the way she kept glancing toward Crockett with barely concealed irritation. The first 20 minutes proceeded normally enough. Lake delivered her standard talking points about border security, her voice rising and falling with practiced political theater. She gestured dramatically, pointing toward the audience and emphasizing key phrases with the skill of someone who had spent years on television. Her supporters applauded at all the right moments, their enthusiasm feeding her performance. Crockett, meanwhile, responded with facts and figures, citing specific legislation and court cases with the precision of the attorney she had been before entering politics. Her delivery was steady, professional, almost academic in its approach. She didn't play to the crowd or use dramatic gestures. Instead, she simply presented information, her voice never wavering from its calm, measured tone. The contrast between their styles was striking. Lake was all fire and passion, her words designed to ignite emotions and rally supporters. Crockett was cool and analytical, her responses crafted to inform and educate. It was exactly the kind of political theater that made for good television, the passionate populist versus the careful professional. As the debate continued, Lake's rhetoric began to escalate. She started making increasingly bold claims about crime rates, border crossings, and the economic impact of immigration. Her voice grew louder, her gestures more dramatic, her language more inflammatory. The audience on her side responded with growing enthusiasm, their cheers becoming louder and more frequent. It was during one of these moments, as Lake was building to what seemed like another climactic point in her argument, that Crockett made the simple statement that would change everything. She didn't shout or interrupt. She simply waited for Lake to finish, leaned slightly toward her microphone, and in her characteristic calm voice said, "The data doesn't support your claims, Carrie." 8 words. Said quietly, without emotion, almost as an afterthought. But those 8 words would trigger the most spectacular political meltdown anyone in that room had ever witnessed. To understand why Crockett's simple statement would trigger such an explosive reaction, you need to understand who these 2 women really are and what this moment meant for both of their careers. Kari Lake had built her entire political identity on being the fearless truth-teller who wasn't afraid to speak hard truths about immigration. The former television news anchor had transitioned from reporting the news to making it, becoming one of the most recognizable faces in conservative politics. Her supporters saw her as a warrior fighting for American values, someone who would stand up to the political establishment and say what others were afraid to say. But Lake's rise hadn't been without controversy. Her claims about election integrity had cost her the Arizona governor's race, and she faced ongoing legal challenges related to those statements. Her political future depended on maintaining her image as the uncompromising fighter who never backed down from a challenge. Any sign of weakness, any moment where she appeared unprepared or uninformed, could damage that carefully crafted persona. Lake's supporters in the audience that night represented more than just political allies. They were true believers who saw her as their champion against what they viewed as a corrupt system. Many had driven hours to attend this debate, wearing shirts with her slogans and carrying signs with her name. They had come expecting to see their hero demolish another liberal politician with facts and passion. The stakes for Lake couldn't have been higher. She was considering another run for office, and events like this debate were crucial for maintaining her relevance and fundraising ability. Every appearance was a chance to energize her base and attract new supporters. A strong performance could generate weeks of positive media coverage and boost her political prospects. A weak showing could raise questions about whether her political moment had passed. On the other side of the stage sat Jasmine Crockett, representing everything Lake's supporters opposed. The young Texas representative had built her career on careful preparation and legal precision. As a former public defender and civil rights attorney, she had spent years in courtrooms where facts mattered more than theatrics, where evidence trumped emotion, and where preparation was everything. Crockett's path to politics had been different from Lake's. She hadn't sought the spotlight or courted controversy. Instead, she had methodically built a reputation as someone who did her homework, who understood complex policy issues, and who could articulate detailed positions on difficult topics. Her supporters appreciated her thoughtful approach to governance and her ability to remain calm under pressure. But Crockett faced her own challenges that night. As a young black woman in politics, she dealt with constant pressure to prove herself worthy of her position. Her opponents often tried to dismiss her as inexperienced or unprepared, and she knew that any mistake would be magnified and weaponized against her. She couldn't afford to appear flustered or unprofessional. More importantly, Crockett had come to this debate with a specific mission. She had spent days preparing, reviewing immigration statistics, studying court cases, and analyzing economic data. She knew that Lake's supporters expected their champion to overwhelm her with passion and rhetoric, but Crockett had a different strategy in mind. She planned to use facts as her weapons and let Lake's own words expose the weaknesses in her arguments. The audience that night represented 2 fundamentally different visions of American politics. Lake's supporters wanted a fighter who would channel their anger and frustration into political action. They valued strength, defiance, and unwillingness to compromise. Crockett's supporters preferred a thoughtful leader who would craft careful policies based on evidence and research. This wasn't just a debate about immigration policy. It was a clash between two completely different approaches to politics itself. Lake represented the politics of passion and instinct, where emotional connection with supporters mattered more than policy details. Crockett embodied the politics of preparation and precision, where careful analysis and factual accuracy were the path to effective governance. The stakes extended beyond just these two politicians. The outcome of this debate would be analyzed and discussed for weeks, potentially influencing public opinion on immigration policy and the broader direction of American politics. Both women knew that their performance would be scrutinized by allies and opponents alike, with political careers potentially hanging in the balance. Lake had arrived that night, expecting to face another unprepared liberal politician who would wilt under her aggressive questioning and passionate rhetoric. She had successfully used this approach in dozens of previous appearances, overwhelming opponents with rapid-fire talking points and emotional appeals that energized her base while leaving her opponents struggling to respond. What she didn't expect was Crockett's strategy of patient preparation. While Lake had been rehearsing her standard talking points, Crockett had been diving deep into immigration data, economic studies, and legal precedents. She had anticipated Lake's likely arguments and prepared specific, factual responses to each one. The contrast in their preparation styles would become crucial as the debate progressed. Lake relied on her natural charisma and ability to think quickly on her feet, skills that had served her well during her television career. Crockett depended on meticulous research and careful analysis, approaches that had made her successful in the courtroom and in legislative committees. As the debate reached its midpoint, both women were about to discover how their different approaches would clash in the most dramatic way possible. Lake's confidence in her ability to dominate through sheer force of personality was about to meet Crockett's quiet certainty in the power of facts and preparation. The result would shock everyone in the room and create a moment that would be replayed thousands of times across social media. The tension in the room had been building steadily as Lake's rhetoric became more and more inflammatory. What started as standard political talking points had evolved into increasingly dramatic claims about immigration policy and border security. Lake was in her element, feeding off the energy of her supporters and building toward what appeared to be another climactic moment. "The numbers don't lie," Lake declared, her voice rising as she gestured toward the audience. "We have seen a massive increase in illegal border crossings, and the economic impact on American families has been devastating. The current administration's policies have created chaos at our southern border, and working-class Americans are paying the price." Her supporters erupted in applause, many jumping to their feet to show their approval. Lake smiled broadly, clearly energized by their reaction. She had delivered variations of this speech hundreds of times, and she knew exactly how to build momentum and keep her audience engaged. But as she continued, her claims became more specific and more dramatic. She began citing numbers about crime, rates, drug seizures, and economic costs that seemed designed more for emotional impact than factual accuracy. "We're seeing record numbers of dangerous criminals crossing our border," she declared, her voice now at full volume. "The drug cartels are making billions while American families live in fear." Crockett sat quietly during this performance, occasionally taking notes on the pad in front of her. She didn't interrupt or try to steal attention. Instead, she simply listened, her expression neutral and professional. But those who knew her well might have noticed the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her pen moved more quickly across her notepad as Lake's claims became more outrageous. Lake was now in full theatrical mode, pacing slightly behind her podium as she delivered her most dramatic lines. "They want you to believe these policies are compassionate, but there's nothing compassionate about the chaos and violence they've created. American citizens are being ignored, while resources are poured into supporting people who broke our laws to get here." The applause from her supporters was now almost constant, creating a feedback loop that pushed Lake to even greater heights of rhetoric. She was clearly enjoying herself, basking in the adoration of her audience and the feeling of complete command over the room. "And they'll tell you the statistics prove them right," Lake continued, her tone now mocking. "They'll throw numbers at you that have been manipulated and twisted to support their failed policies. But the American people know the truth. They see it in their communities every single day." It was at this moment that Crockett made her move. She didn't wait for Lake to finish her complete thought or pause for breath. As Lake was building to another dramatic crescendo, Crockett simply leaned forward to her microphone and said, in her characteristic calm voice, "The data doesn't support your claims, Kari." The effect was immediate and devastating. Lake stopped mid-sentence, her mouth still open as if the words had been physically yanked out of her throat. The audience fell silent, stunned by the simple contradiction delivered in such a matter-of-fact tone. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the humming of the television cameras and the air conditioning system. Lake's face began to change color, starting with a flush that crept up her neck and spread across her cheeks. Her eyes widened, and her carefully styled composure began to crack. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice sharp and dangerous. Crockett remained perfectly calm, her hands still folded on the podium, her expression unchanged. "The data doesn't support your claims," she repeated, her tone as neutral as if she were reading a grocery list. "The statistics you're citing are either outdated or inaccurate." This was the moment when Lake's legendary composure completely shattered. Her face went from flushed to red to almost purple, as rage built up inside her like pressure in a steam engine. Her hands began to shake, and her voice, when it returned, was no longer the controlled instrument of a trained broadcaster. "How dare you?" Lake screamed, her voice cracking as it reached a pitch that made several audience members wince. "How dare you sit there and tell me I don't know what I'm talking about? I've been covering these issues for decades." The transformation was shocking to witness. The polished political performer had vanished, replaced by someone who seemed completely out of control. Lake's red blazer was now wrinkled where she had been gripping the podium, her perfectly styled hair was beginning to come loose, and spittle flew from her mouth as she shouted, "You think you can just sit there with your liberal talking points and dismiss everything I've said?" Lake continued, her voice now a full-throated roar. "You think you're smarter than the American people? You think you can just wave your hand and make the truth disappear?" The audience was transfixed. Lake's supporters looked confused and uncomfortable, unsure whether to cheer or remain silent. Many had never seen their champion lose control like this, and they didn't know how to react. Crockett's supporters were equally stunned, amazed that such a simple statement had triggered such an explosive response. Throughout this entire meltdown, Crockett remained completely still and calm. She didn't flinch when Lake screamed at her, didn't try to interrupt or escalate the situation. She simply sat there, her expression unchanged, occasionally glancing down at her notes as if Lake's tantrum was merely a minor distraction from more important work. Lake was still screaming, her words now becoming less coherent as her rage consumed her ability to form complete thoughts. "This is exactly what's wrong with politics today. People like you think you can just dismiss anyone who disagrees with you. You think you're the only one who understands the data." Security personnel near. The stage began to shift uncomfortably, unsure whether they needed to intervene.
The debate moderator tried several times to restore order, but Lake ignored every attempt to calm her down or redirect the discussion. "I have been researching these issues since before you were even in politics," Lake shrieked, now pointing directly
at Crockett with a trembling finger. "I have sources you've never heard of. I have information that would shock you if you bothered to listen, instead of just repeating whatever your handlers tell you to say." The more Lake screamed, the calmer Crockett appeared by comparison. It was as if someone had turned up the volume on a television while simultaneously turning down the brightness. The contrast became more and more stark with each passing second. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 2 minutes, Lake's voice began to give Out from the strain of screaming, she stood there, breathing heavily, her face still red, her hair disheveled, staring at Crockett as if she couldn't believe her opponent hadn't responded in kind. The room was completely silent now. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next, how Crockett would respond to this unprecedented display of political rage. Would she fight back? Would she try to calm Lake down? Would she use this moment to deliver her own devastating attack? The silence that followed Lake's explosive outburst seemed to stretch on forever. Every person in the room held their breath, waiting to see how Crockett would respond to what everyone agreed was the most dramatic political meltdown they had ever witnessed in person. Cameras zoomed in on both women, Lake still breathing heavily, her face flushed and her composure completely shattered, and Crockett sitting calmly as if nothing unusual had happened. When Crockett finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that people in the back of the room had to lean forward to hear her clearly. But every word carried across the silent auditorium with perfect clarity. "I understand you're upset," she began, her tone exactly the same as it had been throughout the entire evening, calm, professional, and completely unruffled. "But the facts remain the same regardless of how loudly we discuss them." The contrast was stunning. After Lake's volcanic eruption, Crockett's measured response hit the room like a cool breeze on a scorching day. Her hands remained folded, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral and professional. "You mentioned that you've been covering these issues for decades," Crockett continued, still speaking in that same quiet, steady voice. "I respect your experience in journalism, but experience doesn't change data, and data is what we need to base policy decisions on." Lake opened her mouth as if to interrupt, but no sound came out. She seemed physically drained from her outburst, and the stark contrast between her emotional explosion and Crockett's professional response had left her without a clear way to respond. Crockett reached for the notepad she had been writing on throughout Lake's speech. "You mentioned record numbers of dangerous criminals crossing the border," she said, flipping through her notes with the casualness of someone reviewing a shopping list. "According to the Department of Justice's most recent statistics, violent crime rates in border communities have actually decreased over the past 5 years." She looked up from her notes, making direct eye contact with Lake for the first time since the outburst began. "You mentioned drug cartels making billions. That's certainly true. But interdiction rates have increased by 37% over the same period, resulting in record drug seizures and arrests of cartel operatives." The audience was completely captivated now. After the chaos and screaming, Crockett's methodical presentation of facts felt like watching a master craftsperson at work. Each statistic was delivered with precision and backed up by her carefully prepared notes. "You also mentioned resources being diverted from American citizens," Crockett continued, her voice never wavering from its professional tone. "The Congressional Budget Office's analysis shows that immigration actually provides a net positive economic benefit to most communities, with tax contributions from immigrant workers exceeding the cost of services provided." Lake tried again to interrupt, but her voice came out as more of a croak than actual words. The screaming had damaged her vocal cords, and she could barely speak above a whisper. The woman who had built her career on her powerful speaking voice was now literally voiceless. Crockett noticed Lake's struggle, but didn't acknowledge it directly. Instead, she simply continued with her systematic dismantling of every major claim Lake had made during her speech. "I want to be clear," Crockett said, now addressing the entire audience rather than just Lake. "I'm not questioning Representative Lake's sincerity or her concern for border security. These are legitimate issues that deserve serious discussion. But serious discussion requires accurate information." She turned back to Lake, who was now slumped slightly in her chair, still trying to recover from her emotional and physical exhaustion. "I brought copies of all the studies and reports I'm referencing," Crockett said, reaching into a folder beside her podium. "I'd be happy to share them with you so we can have a fact-based discussion about these important issues." The offer was delivered without a trace of condescension or mockery. Crockett's tone suggested genuine interest in having a productive conversation, as if Lake's screaming fit had been a minor misunderstanding rather than a complete breakdown of professional decorum. But the visual contrast told a different story. Lake, who had started the evening as the confident, polished politician, now looked exhausted and defeated. Her red blazer was wrinkled, her hair was disheveled, and her voice was reduced to a whisper. Crockett, meanwhile, looked exactly the same as she had at the beginning of the debate. Professional, prepared, and completely in control. I think what we've seen here tonight illustrates an important point about political discourse, Crockett continued, her voice still that same steady, calm tone. We can have passionate disagreements about policy without abandoning our commitment to accuracy and respectful dialogue. Lake finally managed to speak, though her voice was barely audible through the microphone. You think you're so smart, she wheezed, the words barely coherent. Crockett's response was immediate and devastating in its simplicity. I think preparation is important, she said, her tone suggesting that this was the most obvious thing in the world. When we're discussing policies that affect millions of people, we owe it to them to base our positions on the best available evidence. The audience was now completely silent, mesmerized by the stark contrast between the two women. Many of Lake's supporters looked uncomfortable, clearly disturbed by their champion's loss of control. Some were checking their phones, perhaps wondering if they should record what they were witnessing or if they wanted any evidence of this moment to exist. Crockett's supporters, meanwhile, were watching with something approaching awe. They had expected their representative to hold her own in the debate, but none of them had anticipated this level of dominance. She hadn't just won the argument, she had done it without raising her voice, losing her temper, or abandoning her professional demeanor. I'd like to return to the policy discussion if that's all right, Crockett said, looking toward the debate moderator who had been standing frozen near the side of the stage, unsure how to handle the unprecedented situation. There are several specific legislative proposals I'd like to discuss, and I think the audience would benefit from hearing about concrete solutions rather than just problems. The moderator nodded gratefully, clearly relieved to have someone taking control of the situation. Yes, let's continue with the policy discussion, he managed to say, his own voice slightly shaky from witnessing the dramatic confrontation. Lake made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. She tried to stand up, perhaps planning to deliver another passionate speech, but her legs seemed unsteady and she had to grip her podium for support. Her voice, when she tried to speak, was still barely a whisper. This isn't over, she managed to croak, the words carrying more desperation than threat. Crockett turned to look at her directly, and for the first time that evening, her expression showed something beyond professional neutrality. There was something that might have been sympathy in her eyes as she looked at Lake's disheveled appearance and obvious distress. It doesn't have to be adversarial, Crockett said softly, her voice carrying a note of genuine concern. We're both here because we want what's best for the country. We just have different ideas about how to achieve that goal. The grace of that response, offering compassion to someone who had just spent several minutes screaming at her, seemed to drain the last bit of fight out of Lake. She slumped back into her chair, no longer trying to speak or reclaim control of the debate. Crockett then did something that no one in the audience expected. Instead of pressing her advantage or delivering a killing blow to her obviously defeated opponent, she turned back to her notes and began discussing specific policy proposals as if nothing unusual had happened. For the next 15 minutes, she methodically outlined detailed positions on border security, immigration reform, and economic policy. Her presentation was thorough, well-researched, and completely professional. She occasionally glanced toward Lake, seemingly giving her opportunities to rejoin the discussion, but Lake remained silent and motionless. The audience sat transfixed, not by drama or conflict, but by the rare sight of a politician actually discussing policy details with competence and preparation. It was as if Crockett was conducting a masterclass in governance, while Lake's empty podium served as a silent reminder of what happened when preparation met performance art. The debate officially ended with Crockett still speaking calmly about legislative details while Lake sat slumped in her chair, occasionally sipping water and trying to recover her voice. The contrast between their final appearances was even more dramatic than their opening presentations had been. Crockett looked exactly the same as when she had arrived, professional, prepared, and composed. Lake looked like she had survived, a natural disaster. As the cameras stopped rolling and the audience began to file out, the immediate reactions were telling. Lake's supporters seemed confused and deflated, many of them checking their phones or huddling together in small groups to discuss what they had just witnessed. The woman they had come to see dominate another liberal politician had instead suffered what could only be described as a complete public breakdown. Crockett's supporters, meanwhile, were energized and amazed. Many had expected their representative to perform well, but none had anticipated such a total victory achieved through such professional means. They had watched their champion destroy an opponent without raising her voice, losing her temper, or abandoning her dignity. But the real aftermath would unfold over the following hours and days as video clips of the confrontation spread across social media platforms at lightning speed. Within 30 minutes of the debate's conclusion, someone had posted a video compilation titled Kari Lake's Complete Meltdown that showed Lake's explosive outburst, followed immediately by Crockett's calm response. The contrast was even more striking when edited together, and the video quickly began accumulating thousands of views and shares. Another clip, focusing specifically on Crockett's methodical fact-checking of Lake's claims, was shared with the caption, "This is what preparation looks like." The video showed Crockett calmly reading from her notes while Lake sat visibly defeated in the background, and it resonated particularly well with viewers who appreciated seeing politicians actually discuss policy details. But perhaps the most viral moment was a shorter clip showing just the immediate aftermath of Lake's screaming fit. The moment when Crockett said, "I understand you're upset, but the facts remain the same regardless of how loudly we discuss them." That single sentence, delivered in Crockett's characteristic calm tone, became an instant internet sensation. The hashtag #ShockFactsVivsFury began trending within hours, with social media users sharing the clip alongside commentary about the importance of maintaining professionalism in political discourse. The contrast between Lake's emotional outburst and Crockett's measured response became a symbol for broader discussions about the state of American politics. Political commentators across the spectrum struggled to analyze what they had witnessed. Conservative pundits found themselves in the difficult position of trying to defend Lake's behavior while acknowledging that her performance had been objectively disastrous. Many focused on her passion and authenticity, arguing that her emotional response showed how much she cared about the issues. Liberal commentators, meanwhile, praised Crockett's professionalism and preparation, while being careful not to appear overly gleeful about Lake's breakdown. The consensus seemed to be that Crockett had demonstrated exactly what effective political discourse should look like: fact-based, respectful, and focused on policy solutions rather than personal attacks. But the most interesting reactions came from independent voters and political moderates who had been growing increasingly frustrated with the state of political discourse in America. Many expressed relief at seeing a politician who could remain calm under pressure and actually discuss policy details rather than just delivering talking points and emotional appeals. "Finally," wrote one widely shared social media post, "a politician who acts like an adult and knows what she's talking about." The post included the clip of Crockett offering to share her research materials with Lake, highlighting the stark difference between someone who came prepared to govern and someone who came prepared to perform. The immediate impact on both women's political prospects was significant. Lake, who had built her brand on being the fearless fighter who never backed down, now faced questions about her stability and professionalism. Video clips of her screaming and losing control began appearing in opposition research files and potential campaign advertisements. More damaging was the way her loss of composure undermined her credibility on the very issues she claimed to care most about. If she couldn't maintain her professionalism during a simple debate, critics asked, how could she be trusted to handle the real pressures of governing? Crockett, meanwhile, saw her national profile elevated overnight. Political observers who had previously dismissed her as just another junior representative now recognized her as a skilled debater with the temperament and preparation necessary for higher office. Her calm professionalism under pressure reminded many voters of what they wanted to see from their elected officials. Within a week of the debate, Crockett's campaign fundraising had increased dramatically, with donors responding positively to her demonstration of competence and grace under pressure. Political operatives began discussing her as a potential candidate for statewide office, noting that her performance had shown she could handle hostile environments and aggressive opponents without losing her composure. The broader implications for American political discourse were equally significant. The debate became a case study in communications classes and political science programs, illustrating the power of preparation over performance and facts over emotion. Many commentators noted that Crockett's victory hadn't come from superior rhetorical skills or more passionate delivery. Instead, she had won by simply being more prepared and maintaining her professionalism when her opponent lost control. It was a reminder that effective governance required more than charisma and stage presence. The incident also sparked discussions about the role of emotion in politics. Lake's supporters argued that her passionate response showed genuine concern for important issues, while her critics contended that effective leaders needed to maintain control even when discussing topics they cared deeply about. Perhaps most importantly, the debate demonstrated that American voters were hungry for politicians who could discuss complex issues with nuance and sophistication rather than just delivering simple talking points designed to provoke emotional responses. In the months following the debate, both women's careers followed predictable trajectories based on their performance that night. Lake found herself struggling to rebuild her image as a serious political figure, with the video of her meltdown following her to every subsequent appearance. She attempted several comebacks, but the contrast with her previous confident persona made her seem less formidable and more erratic. Crockett, meanwhile, became a sought-after speaker and media guest, with political organizations across the country, inviting her to share her approach to effective political communication. She began working on a book about evidence-based governance and the importance of preparation in political leadership. The debate also influenced how other politicians approached similar confrontations. Many began spending more time preparing for hostile interviews and debates, recognizing that Crockett's methodical approach had proven more effective than traditional rhetorical fireworks. The lasting lesson of the Lake-Crockett debate was simple but profound. In an era of political theater and manufactured outrage, voters still responded positively to competence, preparation, and professional behavior. Crockett had won not by being louder or more passionate than her opponent, but by being better prepared and maintaining her dignity under pressure. The incident became a defining moment for both women's careers and a reference point for discussions about effective political communication. It proved that sometimes the most devastating response to screaming and fury is simply calm professionalism and a commitment to facts. Years later, political analysts would still reference the debate as an example of how preparation and temperament could triumph over passion and performance. The image of Crockett, calmly reading from her notes while Lake sat deflated in her chair, became an iconic representation of substance-defeating style in American politics. For viewers who want to see more moments like this, where preparation meets performance and professionalism trumps theatrics, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Political discourse doesn't have to be all screaming and fury. Sometimes the most powerful moments come from calm voices armed with facts and the courage to use them. The story of Kari Lake's meltdown and Jasmine Crockett's masterful response reminds us that in politics, as in life, how you handle pressure reveals who you really are. And sometimes, the most devastating thing you can do to an opponent who's screaming at you is simply to remain calm and stick to the facts. Stick to the facts.